Thank you. If ever you want to be an agent. Let me start with a couple of little family stories. I don't know if anyone here got stuck in the awful thunderstorm a couple of days ago. I got drenched. But when my son was rather small, I remember him being with me here at Kew in a pretty spectacular thunderstorm. And we were in that building there, which is the Nash Conservatory, where we sheltered for a while. It's just the other side of the orangery, because he was a bit frightened by the thunder and lightning. And I explained to him that we were quite safe inside, and I did the whole thing about electricity and sparks and sound and everything. And he seemed to have understood my sort of what I felt quite smugly to be my top scientific explanation. He was a lot calmer, and frankly, I was a lot calmer too. So the storm blew over, and finally all we could hear was a distant rumbling. And he looked at me, I'll never forget this, and said terribly seriously, "Don't worry, Daddy, Mr. Thunder has gone now." And it was a delightful example to me, one that I've often thought about how someone can simultaneously hold two mutually incompatible explanations for something in their head. And as we shall see, it's not just children who do it, and it's not always so helpful. Let's go back a few more decades. It's all right, it's worked, thank you. That's me with my dad when I was about 6 or 7 years old. As you can see, it's Kew again. That's the Palm House in the background. And there's my father in a suit and a gloriously unfashionable hat, because after all, it is the Royal Botanic Gardens. And to me, Kew, especially its hot and humid glasshouses and strange plants, always seemed extremely exciting and exotic. And I had exactly the same feeling as I had then when I just walked around here 20 minutes ago. That day was made more exotic and exciting for me by the person who's not in the picture, because he was holding the camera. It was one of my father's work colleagues, a guy called Kiki, who was an engineer from Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was then. And I think Kiki and my dad competed with each other to tell me and my brother more and more amazing things about trees. And there was one tree that Kiki talked about, I can't remember the species, I'm afraid, that he called the lightning tree. And the tree, he said, attracted the lightning, giving power to a scary monster who lived inside. And in Ceylon, he said, nobody would ever dare chop it down for fear of being eaten alive. Now, I doubt that any adult in Sri Lanka believed in that story literally, but they will have repeated it to young children who might believe and not believe at the same time. Now, repeated often enough, a superstition might be a rather useful protection for some tree species. And one thing's for sure, trees need all the protection they can get. So, later in life, I had the opportunity to travel, both for fun and professionally, and sometimes even with Kew expeditions. I got to see just a few more of the 60,000 tree species that there are on this planet, and their variety is just laugh out loud astounding. Remember, trees have to do all the things that living organisms do: feed, defend themselves, reproduce, send their progeny off into the world. They have to do all of those things while rooted to the spot, literally. Now, let me pose you a question. A little seed weighs nothing. A tree weighs a lot. Where did all the stuff come from? Where did all the mass, say, come from to make a tree or a bag of charcoal? Now, you might think that all the heavy stuff came out of the soil. You wouldn't be alone. That's what more than 3/4 of the population think. I can see people nodding. Now, take a look at this pot plant. It grew big without ever anyone topping up the soil. A few drops of baby bio once in a blue moon. How can this be? Where did all the stuff come from? It's the miracle of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is truly astonishing. We animals can only take complex foods and break them down. Plants take the simplest of compounds and build them into complex marvels. So most of the weight of any plant, a tree, the trunk, the bark, the roots, the branches, comes from just two ingredients: water that comes up from the roots, and carbon dioxide, a surprisingly heavy gas that comes in through the leaves. And the energy for the reaction, just the power, comes from the sunlight. Now, charcoal is 100% carbon, all of it. Every ounce came from carbon dioxide that was once in the air. And it's the same with coal. So most people believe that all the weight of that bag of charcoal that I showed came out of the ground. Yet we know that we don't see trucks driving around our streets filling in all the soil that trees have taken up. Like my son and Mr. Thunder, we hold these two mutually incompatible ideas simultaneously in our heads. Our pot plant obviously grows without us topping up the soil, yet at the same time we believe that the stuff it's made of must have come out of the ground. Does this matter? Well, I hope it will come clear that this particular piece of magical thinking actually matters quite a lot. Photosynthesis is amazing, but another special thing about trees must surely be that they survive at all. They can't up sticks and run away from predators. Trees have evolved many ways to defend themselves. This oak tree at Blenheim, probably 1,000 years old, has tannin in its bark, which disrupts the digestive systems of things that might eat it. Trees are often good at sequestering infection, containing it with dead tissue or chemical barriers, or even dropping a limb if things get really tough. One of the most amazing things to me is that over the hundreds of years a tree might live, thousands even, the things that would attack or eat it go through perhaps thousands or even hundreds of thousands of life cycles of evolution. Yet still the tree survives. It appears they have a library of genetic tricks that can be drawn on or expressed when needed. There are plenty of other mechanisms for defense. Latexes and resins that give us frankincense and myrrh and rubber and varnishes. They seal wounds and keep out infection. Cherry laurel at the bottom right there has a two-part poison. Crunch the leaves and innocuous chemicals mixed together react to create cyanide. There are insects and animals discouraged by the caffeine in the coffee plant at the bottom left. But caffeine also discourages other plants from germinating and competing. And despite all these defenses, there's one threat that trees haven't evolved to cope with, and that's us, people. There's things we do directly, such as chopping them down, or indirectly, such as encroaching on their habitats, or especially changing the climate. Coal is the product of millions and millions of years' worth of photosynthesis, of plants taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And oil and natural gas were created by squished plants, algae, bacteria, and all sorts of little critters that lived on the products of that photosynthesis. Millions and millions of years' worth, and we're taking that carbon dioxide and putting it back into the atmosphere over just a few hundred years. It's bonkers. It's creating a greenhouse that's making our climate change at breakneck speed. Trees absolutely hate climate change. Not only because depending on where they are, they have to cope with a hotter or drier or wetter or more changeable world than they or their ancestors had ever known. That's horrendous. But climate change throws all the rhythms out of kilter. The pollinators aren't there when they need to be, so they can't reproduce. The birds or animals that might disperse their seeds are not there when they're meant to be, so they can't propagate. And there's worse. With a changing climate, pests and diseases from abroad can gain a stronghold. Our already weakened trees may have never met those organisms before. They're not in their genetic library. They invade, wreaking havoc as they come. Some people are skeptical about climate change, and the odds are that some people in this room are. Some of that skepticism is enthusiastically amplified by people who make a lot of money out of using fossil fuels. Those people know that spreading doubt will reap them huge monetary rewards, just as the tobacco industry managed to do for decades. Personally, I think that's just evil. There are some people who've been persuaded to regard climate change as some sort of woke left-wing conspiracy. That's wrong, of course. Carbon dioxide is not party political, but it's understandable. That's because dealing with climate change implies some sort of action on behalf of humanity by governments. And if you don't like big government, that's very hard to reconcile. But for most people who sit on the fence about climate change, this is where the common misconception about photosynthesis really matters. Coal, oil, and gas were made with carbon dioxide that plants took out of the air for millions of years. Releasing that in a few human generations is a well-understood fact. That's what we're doing. But if you believe that the stuff that coal, oil, and gas are made of came out of the ground, then you might understandably wonder what fossil fuels have to do with carbon dioxide. You might understandably be skeptical of all those meticulous measurements that support what is now very well understood theory of climate change. And the basic theory isn't really very hard. You use oil, coal, or gas, and its original ingredients, carbon dioxide and water vapor, remember, they go back into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide acts like the glass in a greenhouse. Imagine building a greenhouse in your garden, walking into it, and discovering that it wasn't any warmer than outside. You'd be rightly flabbergasted, yet superstition about climate change and our part in it prevails. Now here's a paradox. Remember Kiki and the lightning tree. Superstition can actually be very effective for protecting trees. The baobab of sub-Saharan Africa and Madagascar, one of the delightfully blobbiest trees on the planet, and hugely important for wildlife and as a resource for people. They can probably live 2,000 years. One of their protections is the superstition that the souls of ancestors inhabit the trees. Not dissimilar to our reverence for cemeteries, really. Call it superstition, call it culture, call it religion, it still affords protection. In Germany, trees are protected by superstition as well. The reason Germans put up with all those lime trees with their aphids secreting sticky honeydew onto their Mercedes, BMWs, and Audis is because the lime tree, or linden, holds a special place in Germans' hearts. Germans all had their first kiss under the lime tree, even if they didn't. It's their version of the English affection for the school bicycle sheds. German courts were held sub tilia, under the lime, and the most well-known street in Berlin is, of course, Unter den Linden, under the lime trees. And when a town doesn't have a lime tree, well, they just paint one on. In Britain, oaks have a special place in our hearts, and it's easier to raise money to protect them than many of our other native species. Superstition can protect trees, but can also lead to terrible harm. A third of those 60,000 tree species I mentioned are threatened now with extinction, largely because of human behavior. The superstition of climate change denial has become part of a wider culture war. That's a war that, in my opinion, is a series of battles whose flames are fanned by superstition or magical thinking. It reminds me of my son, when he was little, saying that Mr. Thunder has gone now. In that context, flipping from the scientific to the superstitious was delightful and funny. In the context of climate change, it's tragic. Remember the lightning tree again. Decades later, that story sprang to mind when I heard that in various European countries there are superstitions about oak trees channeling the power of lightning, and lightning never striking a beech tree. Those stories often involve various rather grisly Teutonic gods, stories not so different from the Sri Lankan lightning tree. In fact, lightning seems to strike beech trees about as often as other trees of any similar size, but there's something about the beech tree that makes it a bit more likely to survive a strike. Of course, during a storm, it'll be raining, right? And the beech tree has smooth bark, so the rain can form a continuous film of water on the surface. When lightning strikes, the beech tree acts like a lightning conductor, the film of water on the outside. And the electricity a little more likely to flow along the wet outside of the tree safely to earth. But an oak tree is vulnerable. Its craggy bark makes for dry patches in a storm. So electricity is diverted through the damp interior of the tree, more likely to be blown asunder. Sometimes superstition has an element of scientific truth, but separating superstition from science requires sober thought. It requires a willingness to look at evidence rationally and the training to do so. And frankly, a willingness to be challenged out of our fixed ideas. That's a rare thing in our increasingly polarized lives, reinforced by instant gratification in social media echo chambers. This photograph was taken in Petersham on the edge of Richmond Park. Our family often made a detour to wonder at this tree, the cedar of Lebanon, and to smell its bark. Hundreds of years old, this cedar. One weekend, we arrived to see it being sawn up. It had been struck by lightning and damaged beyond recognition, and it was the first time I saw my father cry. I remember my mother saying there'd been a whole world in that tree, and as a child, I took her literally, thinking she meant the insects, the birds, the fungi, etc., that lived in and around it. Only much, much later did I realize that for my father, the tree represented his own family and millions of others who were murdered in the 1940s. A culture war, in which a whole world was exterminated. I fear that our superstition war, or culture war, whatever you want to call it, our superstition war over climate change, is leading us inexorably, it seems, to another human catastrophe. Imagine how it would be if we, our politicians, our media, all felt that trees and nature more broadly represented our own personal histories and ancestors. I expect we might protect them. And that is why we need storytellers. Thank you.